So welcome to the park, and welcome to a summer series where we recognize that being in the park is being on holy ground. Being everywhere is being on holy ground, but we don't always stop and take notice of it. So go ahead and take a moment, notice around you, and recognize that this place is holy ground. The breeze is holy, the grass is holy, the sunshine is holy, and yes, even the people around you are holy. As we start at the very beginning, I started to write a sermon and said, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. When we read, we begin with, and when we sing, we begin with, and when we read the scripture, we begin with Genesis, which begins, in the beginning. So we read a story about how this all began, not because we need a scientific explanation of how this all began, but because we need a story that helps us make sense of our own stories. We turn to the Bible to see who we are and who we're supposed to be. The book of Genesis begins with the words, in the beginning, because it says, okay, everybody wants to know how this thing got started. So here it is, in the beginning. And in that very beginning, we establish the framework that we'll begin from to talk about our human existence, to talk about why we're here and what we're to do. It goes on to give us not one but two creation stories. And they're not both the same in terms of the order of how things were created. And yet both of them say that God intentionally created human beings with a firm intention for how we are to live and care for all the other creatures on the earth. On the one that we read this morning, did you notice that all of the trees and plants were given for food? This creation story has everybody being vegetarians. I just thought I'd throw that out there. There is a second creation story that doesn't have that detail. But in that very beginning, it doesn't begin once upon a time or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, because it's not trying to tell us don't believe this. It begins with in the beginning, saying this is what you need to know first in order to understand all that will follow. And it's a pretty down-to-earth, not very pretentious phrase, in the beginning. There's a story, an old story, of a scientist who wanted to prove that there wasn't anything that God could do that the scientist couldn't also do. There's a version of this story that happens when Moses is trying to free the people from Pharaoh, when all of the folks in Pharaoh's court, all the magicians, are trying to prove that there's nothing that God can do that they can't also do. But in this particular story, which is a once upon a time, not true story, this scientist challenged God to a competition. The competition was to create a human being. And claiming that the scientist had studied so much and knew the chemical makeup of the human body, and knew how the bones and muscles and tendons all work together, and knew how all the systems of the body were interdependent, the scientist claimed, I can make a human being. And after much badgering, God finally accepted the challenge and allowed the scientist to demonstrate their ability to make a human being. And as the scientist leaned down to the ground to scoop up some of the earth and to begin to form it into a human being, the voice of God thundered, oh, no, 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 that's cheating. First you have to make your own dirt. The creation story begins with God making everything, even the dirt itself, separating light from darkness, separating the dirt from the water, and putting everything together. As we contemplate this thing that is so much bigger than we will ever understand, will you pray with me once again? May the words of my mouth and the thoughts and meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, for you are our Creator, our Rock, and our Redeemer. And now, dear God, either through me or in spite of me, speak the words that those who are listening need to hear. Amen. And an aside, these services in the park this summer are not going to be live streamed. They are going to be recorded, and they will be streamed later. Our guarantee is that they will be up by Monday morning. We're hoping for sooner than that, but we can guarantee they'll be there by Monday morning. And if there's anybody who'd like to learn more about how to be a part of that streaming process, speak to Tom Alexander over here. He's willing to take on folks who are interested in learning. So in this story from Genesis, God creates humanity and puts us in charge of caring for everything that God has created. And I have something I want to show you. You've probably seen it before. This is a bag. This is a bag that Sharon Powell, who is home recovering from knee replacement surgery, made for me. It says on the side, God, the original they, them. And in some ways, it's a joke for us because we say God is neither male nor female, so we don't know whether to call God a he or a she. Either one is limiting God more than God should be limited. But in this very beginning, in Genesis, God says, let us make humanity in our image, to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea and the birds in the air and the livestock and all the earth and all the things that crawl on the earth. That God says, let us do this. In Hebrew, this is a rhetorical device called a merism. And a merism is a figure of speech that expresses the totality of everything. Those of you who are in Richard Rohr's book reading will understand this. This is a way of saying in Hebrew, everything belongs. So male and female, God created them. Means God created male and female and everything in between. When the Hebrew says something like from the north and the south, it also means from the east and the west and the northeast and the southwest, and, well, you get the idea. That merism is a way of saying, and all of it. For example, the phrase, the heavens and the earth, signifies not just heaven as a concept or earth as that thing that we can walk on, but all that God created. This ancient piece of rhetoric is important today, because we like to make things small enough that we can hold them in our heads. And over again, God invites us to think bigger than that, to open our minds to a larger creation. God gives a blessing to the creation, saying, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and master it. I think it's really important to notice there that that is a blessing. It's not a commandment, a must-do, but it's meant to be a blessing that in being a part of the universe, we are blessed. A blessing is not a requirement any more than when you say, have a nice day, or God bless you, to someone as you're checking out at the supermarket. It's not a command to them, but an expression of your best wishes to them. And that is what God gives to humanity in the story of creation. And God gives to humanity all that yields seeds and fruit to be our food. And God gives everything that we need. And God sees it and looks at it and says, this is supremely good. In the United Methodist tradition, this is a really important beginning of our story, because it's not an original sin. It's an original blessing that God sees the creation and God says it is good. And God invites us to be co-creators with God, taking care of all that God has created. Tables, you sit in a different order than you do in the sanctuary. You might actually sit by someone that you don't always sit with in the sanctuary. Or you might fool me by sitting with the same person but in a different spot. It's hard for me to take attendance when you do that. But this story begins by reminding us why we're here, to be caretakers of all God's gifts to us. But just because God left the earth in our care doesn't mean that we have nothing to learn from it. Any teacher or parent I've ever talked to tells me that they learn valuable lessons from the students that they teach or from the children that they raise. Is that true of you? Do we also learn from creation, that which we are taking care of? We learn that nature needs us and that we need nature. Think about what lessons you might have learned from creation recently. One of mine, a favorite, is when we come across a beautiful sight in creation, whether it's a beautiful sunset or a spider web with dew on it. It makes us stop in our tracks and start to think about bigger, broader things. Perhaps we're designed to be philosophically inspired when we look at nature, just so we can put our frontal cortex to good use. The most reliable thing our Creator could use to inspire such thinking was everything else that exists in creation. This is good news. Good news for all of us who sometimes struggle to find a way to feel God's presence. The good news is that the divine nature is infused into everything that God has made, so we can find a sense of God's presence simply being outdoors. Martin Luther said, God writes the gospel not in the Bible alone, but also on trees and in the flowers and clouds and stars. It's also true that many people have witnessed bears in the wild partaking in an unusual behavior, such as sitting still for long periods, looking in one direction. They're apparently doing nothing but sitting, staring at a scenic vista, such as a sunset, or a lake, or a mountain. There's very little explanation as to what use or purpose this has for the bears, except for theorizing that bears must find such views to be aesthetic and beautiful, and maybe even good for their soul. Knowing that where we are in life and on earth changes us, we can make a plan to be in places that bring us that renewal of our soul. Thomas Merton has said, nothing is ever said about God, nothing has ever been said about God that hasn't already been said better by the wind in the trees. And so as we are here this morning, we are in just a few moments going to share signs of God's presence in bread and cup, reminding us of our story in Jesus, who came to show us how to live as human beings and to remind us that the God who created us offers us the gift of life, abundant and eternal, if we will but enter it. So I invite you now to listen to the stories that are being sung by the birds and the wind in the trees as we have a moment of reflection on this earth.